So again, I'm suggesting that you think of this reading as broken down into three parts, corresponding to the three separate arguments that are contained within this excerpt. The second one begins on page 4, and this is really crucial, not just for Plato's ideas about the immortality of the soul, but Plato's whole philosophy. This notion of knowledge as recollection. And it is, it doesn't actually prove that the soul, let's say, post-exists the body, the total person. It establishes, if it's true, that the soul pre-exists the body. And this is pointed out by other people in the conversation. It leads to the third argument. So in a way, it's not an argument for the immortality of the soul at all, but it is absolutely crucial for the third argument, because it clarifies, it provides a basis for characterizing the ontology of the soul. That is, what kind of being the soul has, or what kind of being the soul is. Because of this mention here, crucial mention here in this second argument about the so-called forms or essences that are actually recollected by the mind. So it's an absolutely crucial argument for understanding what Plato's getting at in the third argument, having to do with the nature of the soul. But this argument really is, again, it's this notion of knowledge as recollection. On page 4, Siebes says, "Your favorite doctrine, Socrates, that knowledge is simply recollection, if true, also necessarily implies a previous time in which we learned that which we now recollect. But this would be impossible unless our soul was in some place before existing in the human form." So it is actually relevant to the topic at hand, but why would Socrates say, and he says it in various places in the dialogues, that knowledge is recollection? That there is no such thing as learning, that learning is really remembering what we already know. Well, I mean, it's a good question. What is he talking about here? I think that the worst thing you can do when you're trying to interpret this notion of knowledge as recollection is thinking that everything that we know is remembered. I think that's just a blunder, a mistake. I mean, I know, for instance, who was President of the United States in 1970. I know that. Did I remember it? Did I recollect it? Or did I learn it? I don't think I can be said to have recollected something that my soul learned before it embodied or became embodied in me. It's a fact, which I picked up along the way. It's Richard Nixon, by the way, for those of you who are my age. So what is he talking about? I mean, I think that when you think about recollection, you got to think about the kind of things that he actually mentions. Let's see if I can find those things in the text. The most prominent example he uses is the notion of equality. The idea, the general concept of equality. This is in pages 5 and 6. I can find some of the other things. But then on page 7, in the middle of the page, he mentions not just equality, but beauty, goodness, justice, holiness. Excuse me, I live in the city. And all which we stamp with the name of essence. Essence, that is sometimes translated as form. So equality in itself, the notion of equality, beauty in itself, the notion of beauty. It's these things which Socrates says that we never actually learn in life, that we are born knowing. We come to remember them. That's what philosophy is about, really, for Socrates, is learning to remember properly what we already know. But in a fairly narrow sense, what we already know are these so-called essences or forms or abstract ideas, you might say. For instance, look at his argument about equality. That where do we get the notion of equality? Well, I mean, he says we compare different things with each other, and we say that they are equal. Two sticks or two stones or two quantities of something that we meet with in the world. But we recognize that they're equal, but then upon closer examination we realize that nothing that we encounter in the physical world could really be perfectly equal, right? That there are always minute differences between things which are roughly equal, and we call them roughly equal. And Socrates' argument, I take it to be, is really how do we recognize that these things fall short of really being equal, being perfectly equal? And his argument is that we must already know perfect equality. That is, we must have a notion of what it means for things to really be equal in order to recognize that any two objects that we meet with in the world fall short of that ideal. It's kind of that ideal that we recollect. And his argument is that, well, the senses, our experience in the world, it stimulates our memory of these things, because we see two things in the world which are roughly equal, and that stimulates our memory, our recollection of equality in itself. Look at the parts of the argument where he talks about pictures. He says, pictures can remind us of the things. Well, they can remind us of anything. He says a picture of Simmias can remind us of Cebes. A picture of Cebes can remind us of Simmias. But a picture of Simmias can remind us of Simmias. A picture of Joe can remind us of Joe. And the idea is that the picture is a representation of the reality of Joe. It falls short of being a perfect representation of Joe, but it stimulates our memory of the real Joe, like seeing a picture, a photograph, a painting. That's actually really crucial, because the idea that Plato had was that the things that we meet with in the world, he mentions justice and beauty and holiness and things like that. Let's talk about beauty. I mean, we go to an art museum and we see a picture and we say, oh, that's beautiful. And Plato's idea is that, well, yeah, it is beautiful, but so is that other picture, and so is that statue, and so is that other object. We all call them all beautiful, yet they're all different from each other, and we call them all by the same name, even though they are different from each other. And we recognize upon reflection that any individual object, it can be beautiful, but it couldn't be perfectly beautiful. It couldn't manifest all of what beauty means, what beauty is in itself. It points towards something. It points towards what he would consider to be at bottom an idea or a concept of beauty, and that our looking at the individual painting stimulates that, and we recognize the painting as beautiful because we already know, in a certain sense, what beauty is. This is really important stuff for understanding Plato, because the whole Platonic philosophy is based upon the idea that there are these essences or ideas or forms that can only be grasped with the mind. We can see a painting, we see it through the senses, but we grasp beauty only with the mind. We can see a person perform an act of justice, but we can only grasp the notion of the just or justice with our intellects, our minds. And the idea here is that these concepts or essences or forms or ideas, in Plato's larger philosophy, if we look at other works that he did, notably his Republic, that this is what's really real about reality. This is what's really real and true in reality, that which can be grasped with the mind. Now, the senses can remind us of those things. They can stimulate the process of remembering those things, but ultimately, those things can only be understood, grasped with the intellect, not seen. That these forms or essences are invisible, they're unseen, in the sense that they don't exist in the phenomenal world, the world that we see through the senses, that we hear and touch and taste and smell. Those things can, again, stimulate our memory. He does say that we are, for instance, on page 7, towards the bottom, he talks about the use of the senses but the knowledge which we acquired before birth was lost by us at birth, and afterwards, by the use of the senses, we recovered that which we previously knew. That is, the senses, sensations of different sorts have their place, but they have their place insofar as they help us to recollect these forms or essences. Now, of course, okay, this is meant to establish that if we're remembering and recollecting these forms, essences, ideas, these abstractions, and we couldn't have learned them in life, that we must have learned them at a time before life, before we became human beings. And what this logically implies is that our souls or intellects or minds had some form of existence before they were embodied in us, in which they learned these things, I guess is the idea. Now, of course, this is not established, again, that the soul exists after death. It establishes, or means to establish, that the soul existed before birth. And everyone in the room recognizes this, so Socrates has to come up with another argument, which we'll see is really based upon the material in this second argument, but is meant to establish that the soul not only existed before birth, but that it must exist after death.